The letter arrived on a gray morning, its edges worn thin as if it had already traveled a long way before reaching her hands. Clara Whitmore stood by the narrow window of her boarding-house room, watching rain stitch dark lines into the dusty street below. She had read the letter twice already, slowly, carefully, as if the words might change if she blinked too fast. They hadn't. Elias Hartwell, farmer, age 37, widowed, no children. Land modest. Life honest. Seeking a wife willing to work hard and build a future together. Clara folded the letter again and pressed it to her chest. Modest land. Honest life. Hard work. Those words did not frighten her. What frightened her was the alternative, staying where she was, where the future felt like a locked door and every day was another reminder that dreams could starve just like people did. She had grown up poor enough to understand hunger, but rich enough in spirit to believe life could still be kind. Her father had been a schoolteacher who died too young, leaving behind a wife and a daughter with more hope than money. After her mother passed, Clara learned quickly how thin the line was between dignity and desperation. By the time she answered Elias Hartwell's advertisement, she had nothing left to lose but the loneliness that followed her everywhere. So when the train carried her westward, its iron wheels singing over endless tracks, Clara prepared herself for poverty. She imagined a small shack leaning into the wind, fields that refused to grow anything but weeds, and a man worn down by disappointment. She told herself she could love a good man even if the world had been unkind to him. She had practiced that kind of love her whole life. What she was not prepared for was the moment the train slowed, steam hissing like a held breath, and she stepped onto a platform that opened into rolling green fields stretching farther than she could see. The land unfolded like a promise. Elias Hartwell stood waiting near the edge of the platform, hat in his hands, posture straight but unsure. He was taller than she imagined, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of tilled earth after rain. He looked like a man who belonged to the land behind him, as steady and patient as the soil itself. "You must be Clara," he said, his voice gentle, careful, as if he feared startling her. She nodded, suddenly aware of the dust on her shoes and the plainness of her coat. "And you're Mr. Hartwell." "Elias," he corrected softly. "If that's all right." As he took her small suitcase, Clara looked past him again. Fences ran clean and straight. Barns stood sturdy and well kept, their red paint bright against the green. Horses grazed lazily in the distance. This was no struggling farm clinging to survival. This was abundance, quiet and dignified. Confusion fluttered in her chest. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as the road curved through the property. Clara counted fields without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, each one wide and healthy, golden heads of wheat bending in the breeze like a sea of blessing. Finally, she spoke. "Your letter said, modest." Elias smiled, a little sheepish. "I suppose it depends on what a man compares himself to." That answer followed her all the way to the farmhouse, a large, white structure with wide porches and windows that caught the sunlight. Flowers bloomed along the fence line, carefully tended. This was not the home of a desperate man. Inside, the house smelled of bread and wood polish. Everything was clean, solid, and warm. Clara set her suitcase down slowly, her mind racing. "You didn't lie," she said at last, turning to him. "But you didn't tell the whole truth either." Elias met her gaze without flinching. "I didn't want someone to come here for the land," he said simply. "Or the money. I wanted someone who would come because they were willing to share a life." The words settled deep inside her. That night, Clara lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of a house at peace. She felt foolish for expecting less, and yet, a strange ache tugged at her heart. If Elias had so much, why had he been alone long enough to seek a wife through a newspaper advertisement? The answer came slowly over the following days. Elias worked harder than any man she had known. He rose before dawn and did not return until the sun dipped low. He spoke kindly to his workers, paid them fairly, and never raised his voice. He noticed small things, a loose fence board, a tired horse, the way Clara flinched when thunder cracked overhead. Over supper one evening, she finally asked, "Why did your first marriage end?" He set his fork down carefully. "Illness," he said. "The kind you can't bargain with." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "So was I," he replied. For a long time, the wealth she saw around her had been earned through discipline and sacrifice, but the loneliness in his eyes was real. Elias Hartwell was rich in land, yes, but poor in the one thing he could not grow on his own. As days turned into weeks, Clara found her place beside him. She helped in the kitchen, learned the rhythms of the farm, and laughed more than she had in years. Elias never treated her like an obligation. He listened to her stories, respected her opinions, and gave her space to decide what kind of future she wanted. One afternoon, a storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds gathering like heavy thoughts. Clara was in the fields with Elias when the rain began to pour, drenching them both in seconds. They ran toward the barn, breathless and laughing, and in that moment, soaked, muddy, and alive, something shifted between them. Standing in the shelter of the barn, rain drumming overhead, Elias looked at her with a vulnerability that stripped away every remaining doubt. "I won't pretend I don't have means," he said quietly. "But I'd give every acre away if it meant never being alone again." The confession broke something open inside her. Clara realized then that the true wealth of this place was not the land, or the barns, or the horses. It was the heart of the man who stood before her, willing to share everything he had without demanding anything in return. Their wedding was simple. No grand display. Just neighbors, workers, and quiet smiles. Clara wore a plain dress, but she had never felt more adorned. When Elias took her hand, his grip was steady, his promise unspoken but clear. Life was not without hardship. Crops failed some years. Storms tested the farm. But whenever difficulty arrived, it was met with generosity. Elias helped struggling neighbors. Clara opened their home to those in need. What they gave away always seemed to return in ways that mattered more. One winter, a family arrived at their door, cold, hungry, and desperate. Clara watched as Elias welcomed them without hesitation, offering food, warmth, and work. That night, as she lay beside her husband, she understood fully. This was why his land prospered. This was why his life overflowed. Because wealth, when shared, multiplies. Years later, Clara would often think back to the fear she carried onto that train, the belief that love meant enduring lack. She smiled at how wrong she had been. She had come expecting poverty and found abundance beyond measure, not just in land, but in kindness, in purpose, and in a life built on quiet generosity. And when people asked how she felt, leaving everything behind to marry a stranger, Clara would answer simply. "I arrived with empty hands. I left with a full heart. Everything else was a gift." The fields still stretched wide beneath open skies, the farmhouse still stood strong against time, but the greatest harvest of all was the life they built together, a reminder that true riches are never what we expect, but what we choose to give.